So in my talk today here at the XR for Change, one of the big points that I made is in thinking about the experiential design frameworks where there's a sense of a quality of an experience, a context of an experience, the character of an experience, and the story of an experience. And the context, I think, is where there's the most overlap in terms of what we're talking about here about the culture, because I said, okay, here's all the elements of what I think of when I think of shared context. It's a shared experience, shared language, shared history, shared values, shared worldview, shared beliefs, shared sense of causality. So why do things happen, and your sense of your worldview of the cause and effect, the shared heroes and enemies. And by the way, I did reference the elements of culture because I feel like there's a lot of things on here that creates a certain context where when you have people that have these shared elements, then you can have that shared context and shared experiences. But I think there's also a dimension of the culture that you're from, being in the United States or other countries, geographically, your age puts you in a certain context, your gender, your level of ability, education, race and ethnicity, your country of origin, religion. I mean, you could probably go on and on and on in terms of all the different levels of context. And I feel like in some ways, when you do an immersive design, to try to account for all the context seems pretty impossible because you're essentially asking for AGI, the artificially general intelligence that's able to understand all of the different aspects of context and common sense reasoning. There's a certain amount of lived experience where you go through your entire life where you just kind of pick up on these things and it becomes invisible and unconscious. But us humans can pick up on these things very easily, but they're actually very difficult to program and to codify because they are so invisible. They're embedded in language. They're embedded in how we behave with each other. They're embedded into these jokes and these taboos. And so to really pin it down, it feels like it's difficult to really define it. But it feels like with these different elements of culture, you start to have at least a cartography where you can look at these specific things and start to work around it or put things into artifacts of the culture and to be able to understand it a little bit more. And other things like urban dictionaries, one example, where it's just like translating different definitions, or I think of memes and meme culture that has like the know your meme encyclopedias. So there's memes that get transmitted and those are communicating the jokes. But to understand what the memes, sometimes you need like a whole encyclopedia to trace back the whole history. And so there seems to be like aspects of internet culture that have started to develop and to support people through Urban Dictionary or Know Your Meme, or the different ways of looking up. Wikipedia would be another outlet. But to really define what that culture is in that context seems to be like the big challenge of what is facing all these immersive creators.
Right. Like building a culture is hard. Changing an existing culture, especially if there's a lot you want to change, that's even harder. And I do want to like acknowledge like it's not easy to change these. It's going to take testing, refinement. But at the top of the podcast, you brought up like, well, what about using like building AI and like programming it and like being able to like record every moment and, you know, being able to like do that type of like AI moderation. Honestly, doing the culture work seems a lot easier than building the AIs, because the thing about if you build a culture, it's going to be stronger. You can get your users to buy in and you can get your users to enforce it. So if you just say, this is a place for artists, and you get your users to keep repeating that over and over and over again, that is going to get you more of that artistic behavior. It's going to get you more creativity, and it's going to be a way of like monitoring and enforcing behavior in a very, very light way. Like it's going to like let you attract the people who are interested in doing artistic pursuits. Whereas if you don't build these elements of culture, they will spring up organically without any influence from you, or maybe with some influence. Like I would guess that it would probably be whatever your employee work culture is like is going to be the user culture that users have inside of like a social VR experience. Because in a vacuum where you're not being thoughtful about these things, a culture will emerge. There will be jokes, there will be heroes, there will be an origin story. And my question is like, do you want to influence that? Do you want to be able to get more positive behaviors or behaviors that you want to valorize? Or are you just going to let it form organically and it might get out of hand before you actually realize there's these tools that are available to you?
Yeah, I guess the word that comes to mind is the architecting and constructing and cultivating of the culture. Maybe cultivating is a better word than architecting, because it is a bit of like surrendering of not really being in control, because it really is the aggregation of a lot of individuals that are collectively deciding to participate in this culture, because you can only do so much, I think. Otherwise, you'd just be able to like shift culture at a snap of a finger. It'd be easy to do it, but it's hard because you actually have to get buy-in from people to adopt it and to do it. And so I guess in some ways it's a challenge of trying to architect or cultivate a culture with something that is ultimately kind of out of your hands.
I don't think it's completely out of your hands. I think that who you show up with, like as a person, in how you interact with people and who you value and who you celebrate, like that gives a tremendous amount of information. And I think the thing is like it could be a lot harder to build a culture using these 9 elements rather than not doing it. But if you do it slowly, if you engage the community, if you create like working groups, like, all right, let's just start. We'll just think about who are going to be the heroes, the archetypes, and the mascots, and just start there. Then that would give you some building blocks, and it could be slower, but as long as the users are on board, then I think that you're going to get more and more buy-in. Like I think there was an example where like a game asked for input on what the code of conduct should be, and as a result, like the code of conduct was followed like to a greater degree than it ever had before. And so it wasn't like write it from scratch. It was like, do you want it to be A, B, or C? I'm not sure on all of the details, but the thing is like by giving people this opportunity to buy in, they're doing that effort. It's going to lead to more collaboration. You'll have stronger connections. The last thing that I would end with is that I think that there's no way to build a good social VR culture if you don't have a good employee culture, because I think that as people are thinking about what are these elements of culture, like these are the exact same ones that I would use to build a company, and be really thoughtful about like what is the founding story, who are the heroes, what is the right language that we want to use, like are we going to call it griefing or are we going to call it harassment? And then also, like, how are we going to manage conflict? Because I don't think that you can have, like, a really, really functional VR or AR or XR app if you don't also have, like, a functional relationship with all of your employees and the company that you're pulling together. So I think that these are really, really general principles that are extremely useful and people should apply to all aspects of their work.
Yeah, I was a part of a startup called Puppet. I was a content marketer, and it was a startup where I was an employee that was less than the Dunbar number of less than 150. I don't know if it was like 128 or something like that. So I came into a company where I was able to functionally know all the different people there, and then it went through rapid growth where it went to like 300 to 400 people over the next year or so that I was there, and I saw the shifts in the culture that was there and how it got fragmented because it was hard to maintain with that accelerated growth. And so I guess my hesitation is knowing where that scalability limits of that, of like how far can you scale a culture, where does it really come down to being able to know people and remember their names? Because once you get up to be too large, like Facebook, it could be considered that there's a certain culture there, but they have to take a whole other approach because it's like 2.7 billion people, or whatever it is, over 2 billion people are part of that community, that network. But I don't necessarily feel like I have a connection to a majority of them. I mean, it's billions of people. So I feel like any platform that you're creating, there becomes a point where you have what is referred to online as the eternal September, which is when you have this flood of new users that are coming in, but they're coming in so fast that they can't acclimate to the existing culture, and then they kind of fragment and create their own cultures.
Unless your culture is so strong that you get other users to onboard your new users for you. And so the value of using these tools is to build a very strong culture where you are very specific about what type of behavior you want, and you're very specific about the types of behavior you don't want. And then if people violate that, there is a conflict resolution process that happens more like a restorative practice, where the person who did the injuring connects with the person who was injured, and then everyone in the community could be part of that. And create these restorative practices. And those would create a strong enough culture that you can get your other users to do the onboarding for you. So that way it's no longer the job of the company. So yes, setting up the culture is hard, but it will offload a lot of the work eventually to the other users because they want to propagate the culture. Like they're going to like the culture, they're going to stay, they're going to get other users to follow the culture.
And I guess if we look at things like Reddit and Discord and Twitch channels, if they get big enough, then they end up having moderators who come in and help to do a lot of that emotional labor of the managing of the community, but also, have that whole scalable ecosystem to be able to manage that. So yeah, it seems like it's definitely possible, but I think probably even more possible within VR because you're having these real-time interactions that may be easier to build up these different types of relationships.